have a good mentor during your graduate study?
I would say yes. So my PhD supervisor was very quiet and focused individual who was originally from England, from Great Britain, and grew up in northern England, and imagined that in his earliest studies was going to become a gentleman farmer, right? He really saw that. He sort of imagined in his mind that that's what he would like to have been, right? He obviously was very academically inclined. He came over to Canada and did a PhD at McGill University, and in the early 60s, I think it was, and at that time. And eventually he ended up at the University of Saskatchewan, and his area of expertise was rumen microbiology. And this is an area of microbiological sciences, but also animal science, understanding the microbial processes in the guts of ruminant animals like cattle and sheep, where the rumen is a pregastric fermentation chamber, basically, that contributes to the breakdown of cellulosic biomass and allows the animals to derive energy through the microbial activity to sustain their lives. So ruminant microbiology was a very important area in terms of animal health and animal production, but it was also the earliest days of anaerobic microbiology. And there was a well-known researcher out of California, Robert Hungate, who developed a lot of the methodology to cultivate anaerobic microorganisms. And those methods apply to anaerobic microbiology that extends to healthcare and to many of the techniques we use today to cultivate anaerobic microbiology. And I know from your work in anaerobic digestion that Hungate played a very big role in laying the foundation for studying anaerobic processes. So Graham Jones was probably the single major researcher in Canada who had a lab focused in this area and attracted some of the researchers who went on to other places and did some great things. And so I gravitated to this area because I wanted to learn more about anaerobic microbiology, and I went to work with him. He eventually became chair of the department. He had a very strong interest in administration, and I think he had lots of interests. He always wore his lab coat, but I never really saw him in the lab, although he was very technically able and would come in, he would be great at instructing and so forth, but he also had lots of discipline and very organized and had a lot of attention to give to administrative processes, and eventually became chair of the department. I don't think he was, so deep into the research, but he was, and if he was, he created an environment that allowed me to, fly to the moon, basically. You want to do this? Good. And see where that takes you, right? And so he was of that nature. There were more engaged professors who had their offices right in the laboratories, and there were several of those who became very important mentors to me as well. And they were part of my supervisory committee. They were probably the people I had more engagement on a day-to-day basis with than my own supervisor, who I'd meet up for updates and so forth. But he was an enabler. If I wanted to do something, he would make it happen, right? I wanted to go to the conference, or I wanted to go down to Halifax and work out of the Atlantic Regional Lab so I can learn how to work with the chemicals that were being isolated there, and that opportunity was presented, right?
So if you want to summarize maybe the main lessons that you learned from him as a mentor, that you're still using them or believe in them and using them nowadays.
Yeah, so I think allowing students to even though there was a research grant, there was a strategic grant, there was a partner, a collaborator, and a National Research Council, there was a significant orientation to an application, and a solution that pertained to animals that were not thriving on grazing pasture. and understanding the interactions of natural antimicrobial products that might be ingested by the animals and interacting with microorganisms in the gut. So that was, not a very well established phenomenon with respect to naturally producing antibiotics and their impact in the environment. And it was the earliest days of microbiome research. So it was just really a wonderful area of opportunity in terms of technology and techniques and so forth. But I think giving people the room to work, and I had to engage across disciplines. I had to go over to National Research Council labs across the way to access an NMR, and over to the microbiology department. I was in the College of Agriculture, what was dairy and food science, which eventually became applied microbiology and food science. So it was just a wonderful array of opportunity to be able to grow and thrive. He was also respectful of my extracurricular activities, although he'd keep and didn't really, put a huge barrier or blanket to that, except when it came to close to finishing my PhD work and writing my thesis up, at which point he says, okay, end of this month is the end of your scholarships. And because I was taking my time writing up, and he said, you got to get it done, get it done. Yeah. So, he also was the master of the English language. He was from Britain, but he himself wrote very well. And as I have said earlier, I really learned that as much as English was my first language, my writing skills were not as strong as they could be, and at least as they were required to be really as successful as I needed to be in the work I was doing and proposing to do. So when it came to writing my thesis, that's where he was most thorough, was in the editing and guidance on my writing and so forth, and I learned a lot from that. So in many ways, he provided his impact on me was in a bit of a different way. He was less hands-on, and he wasn't somebody I'd go out and have a hang out at the pub with, right? He was in that kind of he was kept quite a distance from the lab, in the sense of he was there as an advisor, a supervisor, but I think he sort of imagined himself being dean, and eventually moved into the associate dean's office at some later part of his career after I finished up. But he was a researcher and continued to take sabbaticals and worked in things that were of interest to him. But I think of the students who came through the lab. He let you play, right, and let you and having said that, there were others in the department who really filled up the other needs that you would have had to be able to kick the can and complain about things, or get some more direct advice on something that was going on.
So there are some times that, as we mentioned, that during the graduate study or even early career researcher, when you get your first academic job, you need a mentor to guide you, or maybe to put you on the right track, as this is a new field. And for the early career researchers or new academic appointed people, they have some challenge to find mentor. They're coming to a new university or department, and they don't know people that much. And I experienced that with some of them. They struggle to find a mentor. So what hints could you give them to look for a mentor, and how to look for a mentor for the early career researcher?
Well, sometimes it just happens by chance, right? And I would say a large degree that happens. I do think, for what it's worth, when people are starting to think about, opportunities in joining an organization, I think you got to think about where you're heading and where you're going, right? And if you're not thinking about, well, where am I going to be successful? It doesn't mean you're going to find collaborators directly to work with immediately. But I think the idea would be that you want to go where you think your research fits into the overall ethos and direction of the program, and what you can contribute in your strengths, who around you would be people you would look at as people important to the contributions to the success of the department that you are joining. They may not be directly in your specific area of research, and look around the institution. Like, wait, you're coming to TMU. Why are you coming to TMU? Like, what is it about TMU that attracts you? If you're looking just to hang your shingle to be a researcher and have a teaching position, that's one thing. I think you're going to be less successful regardless of where you go, right? And you got to think about where the organization is and how you feel about things. When I went to the University of Guelph, it was a very natural home for me because there were a lot of people who were contemporaries of mine out of the University of Saskatchewan who found their way as an agricultural, life science focused school. There were people I knew beforehand who I interacted with and talked about collaborations or saw in the community and said, that's great. I have a wonderful opportunity to work with them. Or I meet them along the way and they said, hey, there's an opportunity. I said, I'd love to go and work with that person, right? And that becomes particularly important, as well. And the same when I went to Queens. So it's like you look around, like, where am I landing? What am I going to contributing? Who are the people I'm working with? And some of those are your predecessors, and others are around you. And and then you find them along the way, right? There was a whole community of former principals of Queens and living in Kingston who were always ready and willing to sit down and have a conversation, and sometimes and thinking about others who even outside of your own area of work, and when you live vicariously in some of the administrative roles I've had, you interact with tons of people, right? And you find yourself in communities that you never thought yourself were working with and engaging with and learning from. So it's a bit hit and miss, but you've got to be thoughtful about where you're heading. If you go in sort of sight unseen, I got this job, so glad I got a job, and you go there and you say, like, why am I here? Like, well, I don't think that, so it is a bit of a fit, but it's your choice too as to where you're applying and thinking, well, why would I want to go there? Is that place going to be really supportive to my work? And that could be colleagues and others. And I have to say it, and sometimes it just happens by chance. It happens because of a collaboration. I had a phenomenal relationship with the Pulp and Paper Center in Chemical Engineering at U of T earlier in my career, and Doug Reeve was the head of the Pulp and Paper Center, and eventually became chair of the department. And my collaborator there, Grant Allen, was very hugely influential. We influenced each other, in fact. But Doug Reeve was a phenomenal mentor. And it happened because of a collaboration that grew into an association, and to this day I still maintain adjunct status in Chem Eng at U of T. So it just happens in different places. Sometimes it happens when you meet people in different organizations and you've done something for them, and they reach out and say, what can I do to help you, right? And so when you start thinking a little less of yourself and you're thinking about, okay, getting involved and helping out, these people then line up, and you work together, and it happens kind of organically that, right?
It can happen, but sometimes it's like it comes to our mind as a researcher. Oh, I would love to work with that guy, but that guy was about maybe 100 years ago or something like that. So let's say hypothetically, if you would choose a historical figure that you want to have a meal or a conversation with her or him, who would you choose, and what is going to be the kind of discussion that you can have it?
So I'm going to preface it by a particular story that my own PhD supervisor had shared with me when I was about to go to a conference that was taking place in Banff in Alberta in the early 1980s. And it was a conference that was organized out of the University of Alberta, and it was an international conference in rumen function and rumen physiology, and there was a whole host of people coming to speak, including Robert Hungate from California, who wrote in this monumental book called Rumen and Its Microbes in the 1960s, but had pioneered the Hungate method for cultivating anaerobic. He was a legend, right? I was so excited to go, and I even had my copy of Rumen and Its Microbes for him to sign. And my PhD supervisor said to me, he says, when you meet him, he's just a regular guy, right? Like, like these are regular people. And so my supervisor didn't hold a lot of, I think, the stars in the same light, because sometimes, he was a bit staid, and but he wasn't somebody to sort of even fly his own flag in some respects. Very modest and so forth. But he put in some perspective that there's lots of famous people out there, but maybe at the end of the day, the conversations may not be as interesting as you think they might be. But that being said, I had in my fourth year, in my undergraduate years, two or three individuals, particularly who were legends, and I knew that then and after the fact how prominent they were in their respective fields. One was R.G.E. Murray, and another was Carl Robineau, but they were phenomenal teachers and lecturers and professors, and I just was they were just so humble and so powerful in the way they empowered and shared advice. I remember I've been very fascinated with microscopes for most of my career and the application of advanced correlative microscopy. My earliest introduction to microscopes was Carl Robineau, who was a legend by this and not even recognizing it. He was an MD by background, came out of Europe, and I remember sitting down looking at the microscope in second year microbiology course, and it's just, so you see, he said, so what did you see? And I said, but you didn't look long enough.
Okay.
And and it was just a simple piece of advice about not just seeing what you were told what to see, but seeing things that you weren't told what to see.
Yes.
What did you see, right? And anyway, so going back, so I have to say I love history, historical figures. I've read some remarkable, large monographs and biographies of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. At the interface of science and engineering and art. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci would be somebody who would sit down and what
everybody wants to sit down with Leonardo da Vinci.
This guy tick, right?
Yes.
To fast forward to thinking about Albert Einstein, right?
So what would you ask them if you have that luxury of sitting with them? What question would you ask them?
Understanding what draws their inspiration to focus in on particular problems, right? And captures their interest in a very dynamic way, and in case of Einstein, in a very focused way with respect to relativity and composition of matter and so forth. So it's just that. And yet they all both had very eclectic interests, right? I mean, Einstein became a cultural icon. I mean, he, and engaged in a whole range of different, topics and fields, and politicians and entertainers would seek out his presence for all sorts of things, right? And his own engagement across the world, after the Second World War, and his time in the United States and other places.